Welcome back, everybody, to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. It is Business Monday. It is Saul Kaplan, Mr. Innovation, here from Business Innovation Factory. We're talking education. Last week, test results came out, I think it was Thursday, showing Rhode Island 17% and 20% behind Massachusetts test results. A sobering, Gary Sass called it embarrassing result. And no place to hide, right? You are what you are. The reality is our educational system is significantly, and the performance of our kids is significantly, not incrementally, but significantly behind the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Your thoughts as somebody who works with businesses all over the country and all over the world?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that we're talking about this for more than 24 hours after the results. There's reason to be angry. Frankly, it's because there's nothing new here. We've known this, right? We knew we were underperforming.
But we always had an excuse, right? Oh, they took one test, we took a different test, or this test was flawed, or the sun was in my eyes, or my dog ate the homework, or whatever it was. There was, there was always an excuse.
Massachusetts put in place this test 20 years ago, and they stuck to it, and it wasn't just putting
that's our new excuse, which is they're better at the test, right? The third graders have been taking this test in Massachusetts for 20 years. That's their new excuse.
Well, look, and everyone's teaching to the test.
Right.
We can broaden, what are the right measures? Is it just the standardized test, or are there other ways to demonstrate competence and relevance?
Sure, it's pretty easy. Their economy is a million times better performing, and they have a more educated, more valued workplace, so more companies want to grow their businesses there. That's the proof in the pudding.
This is fundamental. We talk economic development. If we don't get the education piece right, and I'm not talking about tweaks or incremental change, I'm talking about transformation and leadership that's bold enough to clear the way for this. I mean, my mantra is students are waiting. I mean, how long does our youth need to sit and wait, for the adults in the room and our leaders, to wake up and to get this right? 20 years ago, Massachusetts put this in, and it's not just putting in a way to measure,
Absolutely.
that everybody could rally to. They put in place graduation requirements that said if we don't achieve it collectively, we're all to blame, and there are consequences that relate to not only holding students back so that we make sure that the students that graduate from the schools in Massachusetts are actually capable and competent and can perform at high levels in the higher education system at college and universities. We've resisted the test, somebody ate our homework kind of excuse.
Yeah, I mean,
we've resisted graduation requirements too, to hold the whole system accountable, to do this. And 20 years later, it's amazing to even say that, we're just now agreeing on a test, and we still haven't agreed that there should be consequences.
27 years later.
Yeah. We still don't agree on that there should be an actual requirement that if you get a diploma, it actually means something.
So I quoted some numbers to Gary. Narragansett's performance, an affluent community known for good schools, is functionally the same as Fall River, Mass's, right? I mean, how could you be more embarrassed, right?
Well, look, it's New England.
Right.
So I live right near the Massachusetts border. And
it's like you got a wedgie, a wet willy, and a swirly all in the same day when your school system in an affluent community in the state finished behind Fall River, Massachusetts.
Well, how many different ways should we be embarrassed to the point of anger about this? Is it that the neighboring communities just over the border, 3 miles away, perform significantly better than schools on this side of the border? Or let's take our best performing schools, right?
Barrington was 60% competent at the test.
You take our best performing schools, and they don't perform anywhere near the top. They don't break the top 10% barrier in Massachusetts. Who was it said the other day, or wrote the other day, if Rhode Island was a district,
Right.
In Massachusetts, right, it wouldn't be anywhere near the top,
Right.
It would be much closer to the bottom.
It would be in the bottom 10%.
Right. And so this is a huge problem. You would think this would be a burning platform, and that would have happened a long time ago. I'm surprised that we don't see more lawsuits, to be honest with you. The suit that emerged a week or so ago.
Yeah, last Wednesday.
To argue
about civics.
For civics courses. And I agree.
And that was a federal lawsuit.
But I think the suit should be about just the basics.
Right.
Never mind adding things like civics and other stuff. How about the lawsuits that are going to say we're entitled, right, to an education? And when you look at the scores and say we perform 20%, underneath our neighboring state, you would think that there would be more folks testing this in court on behalf of their children.
So, I think the question comes up, why are we in the bottom in our economic rankings? Why are we in the bottom of this? I think we now have the answer. I think there's a causal relationship. If you undereducate people and they underperform for decades, it's going to have a relationship to the economic performance of your state. And to a growing factor. If this was a total blue-collar economy or an agrarian economy, he who is stronger or he could work longer in the mill, that difference mattered less amongst the workforce. Now, the Band-Aid's being ripped off, the reality is in place, and our folks can't perform at the same level.
Well, we've talked a lot about why is it that we're the first in and the last out of every recession.
Right.
Well, because our economy is too dependent on lower wage service jobs,
right.
which are great as entry-level jobs.
Right.
But if you have to depend on that, to raise a family, to get adequate housing, you just can't, right? And so there's no upward mobility or ladder, right? And there's no education system, whether it's our K through 12 system, our post-secondary system, or even adult learning, right? Our workforce development system needs to be completely revamped, right? To create lifelong learners that can constantly reinvent our workforce so they can stay relevant to a rapidly changing economy. We're not ready, right, for the new economy, and so therefore, if you're a company coming in here, you can skim the top level, the folks
right.
that have the best skills, right? But then you run out of road, and you got to move people in here because you don't have people with the resident skills necessary to take the jobs.
So you regularly talk about how Rhode Island really is a perfect petri dish for innovation. Right. 1 million people, it's contained, it's a city-state, there's a commonality of almost every aspect of our culture. Right. Yes, Burrillville's not exactly South Providence, and West Warwick may not be Narragansett, but there's a lot of similarities, easy to get to, etc. Why isn't this the perfect place to reform education?
Well, in theory, it is.
Okay.
Right? 1,000 square miles, 1 million people, kind of tight-knit geography. We all know each other and are connected to each other, and yet we look as fragmented as any place else. We're not
no, actually, we were
right?
very, very consistent. Yeah. We should be proud of our underperformance was consistent across the state. No. It really was unique in that none of our communities performed at the same tier of their economic standard compared to Massachusetts. This wasn't East Greenwich and Barrington killing it and everybody left behind, or just our urban corridor was left behind. We sucked everywhere.
No,
complete consistency of our underperformance.
And so you tell me why we have how many school districts in our small state?
But I would argue that's not the differentiator. Massachusetts has a parochial, a quirky construct of school districts with little tiny towns with their own schools. We're running out of excuses.
But they have statewide standards, graduation requirements.
Right, those are the factors.
And
right.
They have a whole system that moves it. So that's the first step, right? But if we can't all move in concert, and we can't all agree to a standard of achievement, and then you saw how long it took Massachusetts to do this.
Right.
It doesn't happen in a political cycle. It doesn't happen in one gubernatorial term.
But when's it going to start?
Well, it has to start yesterday.
I had James Diosa on here a couple months ago, and he was like, you can't change the schools overnight. And I've said, that's great, because I've been hearing that since I was elected to the Providence City Council in 1990.
Oh, that's right.
So when's the night going to start?
No, it has to start now, and we have to demand it, and someone's got to push. Obviously, the usual approaches to this aren't working,
Right.
And the political leadership isn't there. I think we've got to organize locally, and I
Okay,
want
but
more
if we were in
parents and
France,
students to-
they would build barriers on the main thoroughfares and light them on fire to get elected leaders' attentions. In other cultures, they would light themselves on fire. I mean, literally, when is the outrage? When is the spark?
Well, you don't have to push me hard to start a rant about this, right? But then let's be honest about it, right? The folks of privilege and of means send their kids to private schools,
Right.
And so the people who suffer, the families that suffer, are the folks that aren't privileged and are not within means.
I would have said that always in the past, but when you look at marginally better test scores in Barrington than Fall River, Mass, maybe it's time that folks down at Nyack Point who send their kids down the street.
But, that's not what they're talking about today
Right.
down in Barrington. That's not what the superintendent came out today, when he sent his memo out,
Right.
To talk about what was going on there. Look, you've got to focus on the urban areas, because these are the folks that are getting left behind, right? Yes, we can debate Barrington and East Greenwich, right?
Well,
But
I'll tell you,
still-
it's funny. We haven't done it in the last few years, but probably our first 5 years, we called around to every public or private high school and asked them where their top 3 students, not by name, but just where they were going to college. And I got to tell you, it wasn't that impressive even in the affluent communities. Narragansett performed better than a lot. But, the third kid in Narragansett High School, weren't all going to Harvard versus Weston, Mass. Their first 20 or 30 are all going to A-level schools.
I agree with you, but the real burning platform and the impetus for political change, has got to happen around our urban centers, and families that are not of privilege. You tell me why. I think one of the mistakes we've made, because you can go look at whether it's the private schools or even the charter schools, right, that have had to fight like hell, to get a platform, right? And you look at the results, not in every one of them,
No.
but in most of them. Why is it that they are, and they're public schools for the most part, right? Why is it that we're not putting them in the midst of our public school system and learning from them and leveraging that and getting better? Instead, we've created this us-them mentality. The charter schools are siphoning resources
Right.
from the public schools.
Right.
It's such a zero-sum game, and we're never going to solve it that way. What if we actually looked at the charter schools and says, what's working, right? What are the constraints that have to be removed from our public schools with the student at the center? I mean, this is what it's all about in the end. Everyone gives lip service to it's about students, and everyone says they're about students. It's nonsense, right? It's about everything but students,
Right.
right? If it was really about students, we would clear the way from student achievement, from focus, from applying resources in ways that students actually get engaged in their own learning. Instead, what do? We point fingers at each other. It's the charter schools, right? It's the funding formula, right? And we're so playing what I call a share-taking game. We're so worried about what it looks like relative to the town next to us, right? Instead of thinking about the New England, the country, and the world. And obviously this week, we found out we didn't have a lot of clothes, did we?
Yeah, no. Well, and I think that actually might be the good news of this, is that consistently across the state, the underperformance was so paramount. This wasn't just them versus, and also the excuses are really falling apart, right? There's no viable excuse that any of us can come up with that allows this level of underperformance. I teased Gary, I said, is this because they have the Quabbin Reservoir and we only have the Scituate Reservoir? I mean, there's nothing different in our environment or anything else. And when you see a Fall River outperform or perform similarly to a Narragansett and twice the rate of achievement versus a Johnston, 3 times better than Providence, very similar socioeconomic environments, there's no excuse. There's nothing left to point to or claim other than that functionally the dog ate my homework.
Listen, we have to call it a statewide emergency,
Yeah.
and to treat it like it's an emergency, just like we all rally around when there's a big snowstorm.
Right.
And everybody works together and all the public safety
Right.
entities all come together. Like,
So should the
this is what we
National
have to treat
Guard be
education.
called out and take
Oh,
over schools? I mean,
everybody should be on deck, right, for this problem.
National Guard are all
We should
smart
be
people, they're
rallying around-
well-trained.
Everybody.
Maybe they should go
Everybody.
teach in the schools.
We all have responsibility, for our youth. What's more important than the future workforce of this state, right? And like you said before, our size should be an advantage,
Right.
We should be able to clear the decks and remove resources and fix this, right? We know that there are vested interests. We know that everybody's been making excuses. We have poor governance systems, whether it's the education system itself at the local and state level. Our government leaders need to be held to task. We just have a newly elected, re-elected governor. Like, let's put pressure to make education central and get beyond these platitudes about what we're going to do and stop working on the margin and start working at the core. We can't accept these results. We've got to put in place solutions that actually start to move the needle and put us into a position. And we need to put more pressure, on it bottom up, from students themselves,
Right.
from families of students, communities that can't accept this kind of, never mind mediocrity, this kind of, you have to call it what it is, which is a failure, right? And it's a failure that's central, to the well-being of the state and the prosperity of the state. So this is something that has to be fixed. It seems silly to keep ranting about it, right? Because you're right, we've been talking about this for a very, very long time, right? But we need to do it differently. We can't go about it the same way.
In your experience of reinventing things and developing strategies for, blowing things up in order to start them over, are we now at a level that you really have to think about, the TNT and the Acme company equipment from Roadrunner to be able to reinvent it? What's the strategy that when you're in a cataclysmic situation that you leverage to be able to hyperspeed? We can't wait 27 years to get to Massachusetts testing levels.
Well, if you want to accelerate,
Because Massachusetts doesn't stop. I mean,
No,
there
it's gonna keep
seems to
getting
be
better. That's right.
a brain cycle here in Rhode Island that if we get better at something, we'll catch up with everyone else. Everybody else is also trying to get better.
yeah. Well, first we have to declare it an emergency, and we have to call all hands on deck. Second, what we have to do is, I don't buy the blow it up. Because I don't think change happens that way. I think the way it happens is we have to create the space to experiment with new models and put new models in place and then scale like crazy.
Okay, but I'm
Right,
gonna push back on that. We've had the
can.
Met School for 15 years or 20 years.
no one
We've had
did it.
charter schools for 10 years. We did that. George Carullo pushed through charter schools. There's enough data, good and bad, of charter schools
What did
to be able
what
to
did
say.
the core system do? I'm chair of the board of Big Picture Learning. I
Yeah.
was chair of the board. I'm still on their board.
Right.
Right. They get incredible results. They're very innovative about how they think about measuring performance and capability.
Right.
They get students into real world learning situations, and they're getting kids into college. The big problem they have is when they get there, they bump into traditional colleges.
Right.
That still learn the old classroom way.
Yeah, right.
To do it, right? So I don't think this is a function of blow everything up. We didn't pay attention to what we learned at the Met School and other schools and all these great charter schools.
So did we just give them some stuff to keep them quiet? Here's 10% of the resources. Go ahead, do your thing, but don't mess with Big Brother.
Well, we continue to let them expand, and we've stopped that.
Right.
So that's the first thing. Secondly, we, in return for allowing them to expand, we hold them accountable to help. We team them up with other core public school systems, and we put in place the system to make sure that we're figuring out what works and moving it more quickly into the core. And every time somebody raises their hand and says, you can't do this or you can't do that, we need leadership to say,
all right, but I'm going to argue. You go over the border to Blackstone Valley Technology in Massachusetts. That is a high-performing school, primarily made up of what we would call socioeconomically disadvantaged kids, and they are crushing it. There's no shortage of petri dishes to be able to look and scale. We just don't want to necessarily go and look at them and scale them because we don't want to change it.
Those models, and we have to move them more close to the core, and we have to move more quickly to adopt some of those practices. We also have to get away from there's one model that works the same in every place. The model that's going to work in Central Falls is different than the model in Barrington. It just is.
Okay, but that's true in Massachusetts, right?
Correct.
But they're incrementally 70% or 20% better performers, whether it's in Longmeadow, Mass, in Central Mass, or Fall River's way better than our Johnston or wherever it is.
Well, so they've back to how we started the conversation.
Which is
fundamental infrastructure, a standard of performance that everybody agrees to, and there are consequences for not moving aggressively towards achieving that standard, including holding students back so that the diploma actually has meaning. That's just the ticket to get into this race.
Right, that's just to get into the game.
Like you have to start there. If we don't all agree on what education's for, what we're trying to accomplish, how we're going to measure whether students, teachers, communities, and schools are achieving it, which is what we've been doing for 20 years, right? And we're all going to point fingers at it. So no wonder we don't get the kind of improvements that you would expect. So yes, of course, put the fundamentals in place, right? Which is no political easy task, right?
Absolutely.
Obviously. But listen, we've got to move on with that, but then we've got to also recognize that in some neighborhoods, it's not just about education. You have to look at the community itself, and you got to rally around students and families, and we got to help them. I call it the social determinants of learning, the same way we talk about it in healthcare. You can't just look narrowly at
let me ask the last. I've got two last questions in the last couple of minutes. One, why aren't parents more outraged? Why aren't parents across the board? It's the one common thing that somebody who lives in a plat in Johnston, or on the water in Narragansett, or in a tenement in Providence, all have the same. Parents love their children. They dedicate their lives to their children. They've all got to be sick to their stomachs about these ramifications of this.
This befuddles me too. And this is how I started earlier. I'm surprised that there aren't more lawsuits that are coming from families that are disenfranchised by the poor performance of our schools.
Yep.
I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I'm surprised we haven't seen it yet. There are a group of parents who just opt out because they have resources to opt out. But then there are a lot of parents who either don't want to or can't, right? And there's a lot of those, right? And they have to get angry, right? And they have to start pushing, not just to elect politicians who get it and are willing to stand up and make something happen. I think we're past that now. I think we gotta go directly to the judicial system and say, look, like our communities, our kids, our families, have a right, to be relevant in society, and education is a really important point to that. People should be angry in our state. I'm gonna be really disappointed if we're sitting here 3 weeks from now, and we've moved away, because 3 weeks have passed, and then we're
we'll be talking about something else.
The emergency that it is.
Yeah.
I think we got to call out our leaders, and we have to be relentless and not allow them to change the subject or wave their hands through what's going to be done here. We have to rally around as community, as citizens, and say, this is an emergency. We can't just have incremental change or point solutions or individual programs, and think that it's going to get better. Like, we need dramatic change in education with a sense of urgency, and I don't sense it. I don't see it, right? And so we need to hold our leaders accountable for it.
I appreciate it. Saul Kaplan, Business Innovation Factory. Next week we'll be talking about the URI offense and how we restructure and innovate that,
Boy, that was
after
a-
the disappointing loss to Providence College on Saturday for URI grads. I want to thank you as always for coming in. And hopefully this is the beginning of a ongoing narrative on improving Rhode Island's educational structure and the implications that it has to the state's economy and economic interests. I want to thank everybody for tuning in on Business Monday here at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Thank our friends at Deepwater Wind, and we'll see you back tomorrow here at GoLocal Live. Kate Nagel will be back with her show in the afternoon and an all-star lineup. Thanks everybody for tuning in.